Hilchos Maaseh Hakorbanos Perek Shneim Asar, the laws of sacrificial procedures, chapter 12. We've spent the first 11 chapters of these laws talking about animal sacrifices. Today we move on to the mincha, the flour offering. Plural, it's called menachos. Torah talks about at length the flour offering. It's typically brought by the poor person who couldn't afford to bring an animal. There are many different categories of flour offerings and many specific laws that pertain to how to sacrifice them, which are going to be the subject of today and tomorrow's chapter, God willing. Let's get right to it. Halacha Aleph. Hamenachos heim min hakorbanos. The flour offerings, the word mincha, by the way, literally means a gift. The first time we see it in the Torah context is with Yaakov and Esav. When Yaakov finally reconciles with his brother, he wants to send his brother a mincha, a gift. But in the context of sacrifices, it always refers to flour offerings. So the menachos are an actual category of sacrifices. The flour offerings, when the flour is offered on its own, not as part of the libations. Way back in chapter 2 of these laws, that Rambam said that every single animal sacrifice is accompanied by flour. But that flour is called minchas nesachim. It's the flour offering as part of the libations. Here we're talking about flour offerings that come on their own, not as libations. Mehem minchas tziburu, mehem minchas yachid. We have two categories. We have communal flour offerings and we have individual flour offerings. And the general rule is, v'chol hamenachos soiles chitin. All flour offerings are brought from wheat flour. Chutz miminchas soita v'oimer hatnufa, with the exception of two flour offerings, one brought by the suspected adulteress, and the one that was waived, the omer offering on the second day of Pesach, shehem minas so'irim, which are from barley. For two different reasons. The suspected adulteress brings a barley offering, as the Talmud says, because she acted like an animal and therefore uses animal fodder or animal food. Barley was usually used for animals as her sacrifice versus wheat flour, which is more reserved for humans. And the omer offering was waived out of barley simply for technical reasons, because it was meant to permit new grain which had grown during that year, and typically the barley ripens before the wheat, and therefore they used the barley, not the wheat. Wheat was brought on Shavuos in the form of the shtei halechem, the two breads. But as a general rule, all flour offerings are wheat flour except for these two. Halacha Gimel, let's begin with the communal flour offerings. Shalosh menachos latzibur. There are three communal flour offerings. First of all, omer hatnufa. The omer offering, the omer that was waived, that is what we just discussed. It is brought fully on the altar, as will be explained in much more detail in the next set of laws, Tamidinu Musafin, when we're going to discuss, there's a whole chapter on it, how it was brought and the whole procedure that accompanies that. Then the second communal flour offering was the shtei halechem, shemevin b'yom atzeres. I just mentioned that before. The two breads that we bring on Shavuos day, the first wheat offering of the year. Ve'elu nikru mincha. These are called in the Torah by the name mincha. They're called flour offering, but they don't go onto the altar. They are actually leaven. As we'll soon learn, another general rule of mincha is that all flour offerings were retained as matzah. They weren't allowed to rise. The wheat, the flour, and the water as it would mix wouldn't be allowed to rise. But the shtei halechem actually were chametz. They were leaven. Va'aleihem nemar, it is about them that the Torah says, Karban reishis takrivu oisam laHashem, bring them as the first offering to God, ve'al mizbeach lo yalu, but they shouldn't go up on the mizbeach. The context of this verse is where it says in the last verse that you should never bring anything leavened on the altar, as we saw in the last set of laws, that the prohibited entities for the mizbeach. The Rambam talked about how chametz, leaven and leavening agents, shouldn't ever be brought on the altar. This is the exception to that. The Torah says, while you usually shouldn't bring chametz on the altar, you could bring them when it comes to the first offering, the shtei halechem, which is the first wheat of the new harvest, that you do bring as a korban to God. However, you don't bring them onto the mizbeach. The third communal flour offering, hu lechem hapanim sha'isin b'chol Shabbos, is actually the famous showbreads, the lechem hapanim that was made every single week. It too, or them too, also were not offered on the Mizbeach. They were all eaten by the Kohanim, as shall be explained also in detail, but the bottom line and the generality of it is, there was 12 of these loaves that were always on the shulchan, always on the table that was situated inside of the temple structure. Every week, 12 new ones were baked, and they would replace the old ones on Shabbos, and then the 12 were taken off and were eaten by the Kohanim. It was a big miracle that they stayed fresh for the whole week and actually also warm. That was one of Hashem's manifestations of His presence in the Holy Temple. That covers the 3 communal offerings based in flour. Halacha daled v'teisha minchos hayachid. There are 9 flour offerings that are offered by an individual. The kulan kreven lemizbeach, they all go on the altar. The eluhin, and they are the following: minchas choite. Start at the top right. The mincha of a sinner. This refers to specific sins for which the Torah prescribes the korban oile v'yored, the fluctuating sacrifice. Depending on how much you can afford, you bring either an animal, birds, or flour. When you're the poorest and you can only bring the flour, that flour offering is called the minchas choite, the mincha of the sinner. There it is. That's the flour offering offered by a poor person when he's obligated to bring technically an animal, sin offering, but he can't afford it. Minchas saita, then we have the second one as the mincha of the suspected adulteress. That's the mincha known in the Torah as the flour offering of jealousy, which we've already explained at great detail in the end of the Rambam's 4th book. There was a section of laws called the laws of the saita, and over there we talked about the whole procedure, a very special and unique procedure that was accompanying, or the test, almost would accompany the test of the bitter waters that every sota was subjected to. Number 3, hamincha shemakriv kol kohen tchila k'sheyikanes la'avayda. We have the flour offering that every Kohen had to bring at the first time that he would enter temple service. It was like his inauguration sacrifice. Shemakriv b'yisabiyade, which he must offer by hand, v'hi anikras minchas chinuch, known as the inauguration mincha. We actually mentioned this in earlier in this book, how every single Kohen used to bring this mincha of inauguration. Number 4, hamincha shemakriv ken gadol b'chol yom. The special flour offering offered by the high priest every day, v'hi anikras chavitin, that's called the pancakes. Had a special way to make it, and that's the Kohen Gadol's mincha, he brought it. Minchas hasoilas. Then we have what's called the flour offering, because it was based in a dry, raw flour, as we'll see. V'hi ba ben eder unadava, it's brought not as any form of obligation, it's brought voluntarily. Minchas hamachavas, v'hi ba ben eder unadava, same thing is what's called the mincha of the pan, and we'll define exactly what this means. It also came voluntarily. Minchas hamarcheshes, the mincha of the deep fried pan. V'hi ba ben eder unadava also comes voluntarily. Minchas ma'afei tanor, the oven baked flour offering. V'hi ba ben eder unadava, which also comes voluntarily. Neder and nadava, by the way, are 2 kinds of the voluntary donations. We're going to explore them in chapter 14. Neder basically means you put the obligation on yourself. I'm going to bring X, Y, and Z. Nadava means you put the obligation on the object. This is going to be dedicated for a sacrifice. Minchas rikikin. Finally, we have the 9th one, the flat-caked flour offering. V'hi ba ben eder unadava also comes voluntarily. So if you think about it, the first 4 are obligations of sorts, and the last 5 are all donation type of mincha, where you can choose, if you're donating a flour offering voluntarily, you can choose to bring it of any one of these 5 types, which the Rambam will go into detail on them. Kol hamenaches akrebes legabe hamizbeach, says the Rambam, a general rule. All flour offerings which end up being offered on the altar, ein kol achas me'em chusa me'isarin, there is no less than an isarin of flour. An isarin is 1/10 of an ephah. It's an amount that's pretty much equivalent to 43 1/5 eggs, is the way the Torah describes it. It's a pretty big amount, generous amount of flour, and that's the minimum. When you bring a flour offering to the Mizbeach, it could not be less than this amount. Umi'utay ma'akev eskulay. And even the smallest portion of it is essential to it all. You're missing a tiny bit, the whole thing is out. However, in terms of the maximum, it depends. The minimum is all across the board in Isarim. In terms of the maximum, the last 5 on that chart that we just saw, the 5 voluntary mincha offerings, yesh leili hisnade v'linder mehen kol masha yirtze afilu 1,000 isarin. You can commit to donate voluntarily, however much you want, even if it's 1,000 isarins. You're feeling super generous, bring 1,000. Aval minchas ha'omer u'minchas choite u'minchas knois u'minchas chinuch v'hachavitin. But the omer offering, which is one of the communal flour offerings, and the first 4 of the individual offerings, the sinner, the suspected adulteress, the inauguration, and the pancakes of the Kohen Gadol, kol achas me'en isarin echad lepachis v'leyoser. Each one was based on a minimum, but also a maximum of an isarin. It was only this amount, 1/10 of an ephah of flour, that was brought as the sacrifice. Halacha vav, another general rule pertaining to menachos. Kol menachos akrebos legabe hamizbeach. Whenever you brought a flour offering on the altar to unois hagasha b'mayrav, part of, and an integral part of, the procedure of their sacrificing was to bring the flour offering close, to touch it, on the west side of the altar. To unes hagasha b'mayrav, keneged chuda shel keren dremis ma'aravis. Let's just use a map to understand this. Temple structure is in the west. So if this is the Mizbeach, the altar standing in the courtyard, this would be the west side. You have to be on the west side and bring it towards, touch it to the corner of the southwestern corner. So if this is east, this is west, this is south. Southwestern corner is right here. Let's just put it into 3D for a second. That would be this corner right here. And just the way to remember it is the airline. Yeah, southwest. Think about southwest, that's the corner for the mincha. The einon tu'unes tenufa, but they don't require it to be waved. Unlike we saw in previous chapters where, let's say, the peace offering had to be waved, Thanksgiving offering had to be waved, but the minchas do not have to be waved. Chutz mi mincha soita va'emer tenufa, except for, again, those two offerings, the suspected adulteress's offering and the omer offering, which is literally called the omer of the waving. Sheshnein tu'unes tenufa ve'hagasha, they both require both being waved and being brought close, but every mincha across the board shares the obligation to be touched to the southwestern corner of the altar. Halacha Zayin, another general rule pertaining to all menachos. Kol ha-menachos hakrebos legabe ha-mizbeach. All flour offerings that were offered on the altar to uneis shemen ulevayna have to be accompanied with oil and frankincense. This is the frankincense in its more raw form, but it was actually ground into a spice and sprinkled onto the flour offering. Loig shemen l'chol isarein v'koimetz levayna l'chol mincha. For every isarein of flour, again, this is a minimum of an isarein of flour, but if you brought 10 or 20, you would put in one log. A log is about 12 ounces of oil per isarein, and a koimetz is a special, we'll call it 3 fingers full. Okay, that's the way it was done. You put 3 fingers in, you folded it up, and you took what's called a koimetz of levayna, frankincense, for every flour offering, bein shayisa isarein echad, bein shayisa shishim isarein, whether it was 1 or 60 israelis of flour, doesn't make a difference. She'ein mevin bikli echad yasad al shishim isarein kameshi yizbar. The reason we just use the word 60 is because, as we're going to see, even if you donate 1,000 isareins, in one container you can only bring 60 at a time. So the point is, per every isarein, 1 leg of oil, and per every mincha, 1 koimetz of frankincense. Chutz mi minchas knoyos or minchas chayte, this time with the exception of the soita, the suspected adulteress, and the sinner's offering, where Torah says clearly, no oil or frankincense. Lo yasim aleh hashemen, lo yitin aleh halavayna. Here you can see the contrast. I just picked one of the verses where it says on the mincha to pour, v'yatzak aleh hashemen v'nasan aleh halavayna. Most flour offerings had to have oil and frankincense placed on them. And when it comes to the minchas chayte, the sinner's mincha, it says lo yasim aleh hashemen v'lo yitin aleh halavayna. Don't put any oil, don't put any frankincense. And the reason is because we don't want to honor a sinner. Right? There's oil and frankincense presumably bring beautification to the flour offering, and the sinner doesn't deserve beautification. Halacha ches nasan v'hikriv. If the sinner did go ahead and put the oil and the frankincense on his mincha, like al hashemen b'fnei atzma v'levena b'fnei atzma, you get lashes for each one on its own. Torah says the word loy twice. Don't put oil, don't put frankincense. That's 2 don'ts. If you put both, you transgress both don'ts, you get 2 sets of lashes. Nasan kli sheyesh bo shemen elevena al gabeha. If you put a container that had oil and frankincense on top of it, but you didn't directly pour the oil and the frankincense onto the flour, eina over v'le pasal. You haven't transgressed it, neither have you disqualified the sacrifice. It's totally fine. Minchas chinuch v'achavitin, with the inauguration offering and the pancakes offering, you have to add some oil to each one, as shall be explained. In other words, now we're going through all the general rules. Soon we'll go through the specifics of each type of mincha. Another general rule: all minchas that were brought on the altar to nikmatzos have to be 3 fingers fold. I don't have a better way to say this, but kmitza is a very special technique that was done in the temple, like this, as you see it in the picture. And you have to take the kmitza from the flour offering. And you bring that amount that fits in those 3 fingers onto the altar. And the rest is eaten by the kohanim. With the exception of a mincha brought by a kohen, a male kohen, we had this in passing in earlier chapters. There's no kmitza from the kohen's flour offering. You bring it all on the altar. As it says, the mincha of a kohen should be entirely. The Rambam just quotes the first 3 words, but the end of the verse is it should go totally on the mizbeach. It shall not be eaten. So from here, in summary, you learn that the mincha of the inauguration, it's brought by a kohen. The mincha of the pancakes, which is also brought by a kohen, the high priest. Anytime a Kohen brings a mincha of a sinner or a voluntary mincha, kula nisrafes lagabe hamizbeach ve'eino nikmatzes, they're all burned completely with no kmitza. Halacha yud hakohenes. If it's a female Kohen bringing the flour offering, minchasa nikmetzes keminchas Yisrael u'shiara ne'acholin. She's considered like a regular Jewess. Her mincha does have kmitza done to it, like the mincha of a regular Jew, and the leftovers have to be eaten. Halacha yud aleph vladish and nisarvu v'rekolechon me'an safek. Always got to bring in these complicated cases. Two sets of parents had children. One had the father who was a Kohen, one whose the father was not a Kohen. The babies got mixed up. Each one is in doubt whether he's a Kohen. If they bring a mincha, what do? If you're a Kohen, you have to burn it, and if you eat it, you're transgressing. If you're not a Kohen and you don't do kmitza separately, you're transgressing. So what do? Minchasam nikmetzas keminchas Yisrael. You do kmitza to the mincha, just in case it's a mincha of a regular Jew. Ve'eina ne'acheles keminchas kohenim, but it cannot be eaten like the mincha of a regular Kohen, because maybe he's a Kohen. What do you do with this mincha? The koimetz, which was separated as a kmitza, is offered on its own, as though it were a regular Jewish mincha sacrifice, and the leftovers would be spread on the area that's called the ash heap, as the Rambam told us in the earlier chapters. There were 3 places where they would burn disqualified sacrifices. One was in the temple courtyard, one was on the Temple Mount, and one was outside Jerusalem. And they would burn it in one of those places. Different interpretations among the commentators as to which one it is. Rashi holds it's the one that's outside the temple courtyard. Tosfos says it's the one inside the temple courtyard, and it's just an argument amongst the Rishonim as to which place that was. But definitely it was just simply burnt, not on the Mizbeach, off the Mizbeach. Halacha Yud Beis kol nesuis lakohenim. If a woman is married to a Kohen, ben kohenes ben Yisraelis, whether she herself is born to a Kohen family or not, ein shiyare min chayseim ne'acholim, the leftovers of their flour offerings are not eaten, like Kohenic mincha offerings, because part of it belongs to their husband, and the husband wouldn't eat from this mincha. But on the other hand, it cannot go fully to the fire, because there's a woman involved here who doesn't have to have her mincha burnt. Same scenario here. You would do the kmitza, burn it on its own on the altar, take the leftovers, and put them in the ash heap, again, either inside or outside the temple courtyard. Kmitza may be done anywhere in the temple courtyard. It's also kosher if you did it inside the temple structure. Halacha Yud Gimel. Makdishin mincha bekli shal gabe karka, v'koimtzin mikli shal gabe karka. When you consecrate a flour offering, and part of the consecration is that the flour has to be sitting in a vessel, as we're going to learn. And also when you do kmitza, which is done from the vessel in which the flour is contained, you can do both of those stages from a utensil that's sitting on the ground. Ve'in makdishin hakoimetz bekli shal gabe karka. But the kmitza, once you take the kmitza and you put it into another vessel and you want to sanctify that kmitza, you cannot sanctify the kmitza, or the koimetz as it's called, on a utensil that's sitting on the ground. It has to be raised above the ground. When you offer the koimetz on the altar, at what point does that permit the rest of the flour offering to be eaten? Once fire catches to most of the koimetz. Another general rule. All minchas that are offered on the altar eventually matzah have to be matzah. They cannot be allowed to rise. Even the leftover flour that the kohenim get to eat and bake it into bread. Even though they can eat it in whatever form, with whatever food, with honey, they cannot consume them as leaven. As it says, they shall not bake their portion into chametz. Even their portion shouldn't become chametz. It's actually a misread of the simple reading of the verse. In the verse, literally, it's punctuated, comma, it shall not be burnt, it not be baked as chametz. I have given them a portion from my fire offerings. But the Talmud interprets that the word chelkam can be attached to the first part of the sentence. Even a portion, the portion that comes to the Kohanim, should not be eaten as chametz. If you did, made it into leaven, the Kohen would get lashes. If somebody even adds to the leavening that somebody already did one stage of leavening, you're also liable. And you get lashes for every deed done to the dough while it's in a state, or while causing it to become chametz. Ketzad, what does that mean? Lasha chametz. If somebody kneaded the dough as chametz, as a leavened dough, oy archa chametz, or he shapes the dough as chametz, oy kitva chametz. Kitva classically means rubbed it with water, kind of to smooth it down on the top, should be like a nice sheen to the loaf. Oy afa chametz, or baked it as chametz, loika, you get lashes. That's the way it's classically translated. The Rambam himself, in the commentary to the Mishnah, seems to imply that lasha actually does not mean kneading. Lasha means mixing the flour and water. Orcha is kneading. Kitfa is shaping. But the point is, every individual act done with the dough gets you lashes. Shenemar, how do we know this? Because it says in the verses, there's two verses talking about not making minchas into chametz. One verse says, lo yisei aseh chametz, it should not be made chametz. V'nemar, and then it also says, lo yisei afeh chametz, don't bake it as chametz. Two stages, don't make it chametz, don't bake it chametz. That means that they both incur their own prohibition. That holds you obligated, liable for each individual action done to the dough. Also chametz mitchila v'atzaif, even if you made the dough chametz from beginning to end, like out kol ma'aseh, and you get individual lashes for every action that you did. A person places a leavening agent on a dough, walks away, and it becomes leaven on its own. He didn't do any active part of the leavening process. Leika, you still get lashes. Placing the leavening agent in the dough, in this case the yeast or whatever it is the deed. In order to get lashes, you have to do a deed. That's the deed. You did a prohibited deed by putting the yeast onto the dough. If you spiced up the Kohen who gets the leftover of the flour offering, he spices it up with ketzach, is caraway, shumshimin is sesame seeds, or any other type of spices or oils, ksheda, that's kosher, again, it's not leavened. Matzah, it's matzah, there's matzah metubeles, maybe it's a spiced up matzah, but that's fine, it's not chametz. If somebody takes a disqualified flour offering and makes it into chametz, patur, he's exempt. Shenemar, because it says in the same verse we quoted before, Asher takrivu laShem leitei aseh chametz. The type of flour offering which you offer to God should not be made as chametz. Haksheda laShem le'apsula, only the one that's kosher for God, and the one that's disqualified for God. Chimsa kishi ksheda. What if you made it leavened while it was kosher? The yatzas lechutz, then it went out of the temple courtyard, which makes it disqualified. The chazar v'chimsa achar shenifsala b'yitziasa, and then you add to the leavening after it already became disqualified with the exit. Einei loike, you don't get lashes for that. Chimsa b'reisha shel mizbeach einei loike. If you made it leaven on the top of the altar, you also don't get lashes. Shenemar, as it says, asher takrivu. It has to be a mincha which you're going to offer, not which you've already offered. By bringing the flour offering to the top of the mizbeach, you've already offered it, it's already kosher. Leavening it afterwards is not a problem. That makes you get lashes. If somebody in the baking process of the showbreads, of the lechem apanim, if somebody were to make them chametz, like you get lashes, shenemar, because it says in the verse, kol hamincha, anything, any offering which is called a flour mincha offering, and you make it leaven, including the lechem apanim, which is also called mincha, you get lashes. Aval minchas nesachim, but the flour offering that accompanies other sacrifices as its libation, ein ba malkos, there's no lashes. Shem gibla b'mayim, because if you knead it with water, harei nifsel kedem shetis chametz, it becomes disqualified before the leavening. V'im gibla b'shemen shel nesachim, mei perius hein me'ena machmitzin. If you knead it with oil, the accompanying oil of the libations, it's called fruit juice. It's not water, and you cannot make halachic chametz. Any flour used in the preparation of flour offering, any wheat used in the preparation of flour offerings, we don't do lisisa. Lisisa was a procedure they used to do to wheat kernels to soak it in water to make better products out of it. You don't do that to mincha wheat. Shamayach mitzu might become chametz. Because this lisisa procedure was usually done outside the temple courtyard. Not everybody had enough alacrity to guard it from becoming chametz. In the temple, we have a rule that kohanim are very, very careful about whatever is under their supervision. But outside, you can't really know. But the barley omer offering, because it is a communal offering, leisis and isa, we do the lisisa. We have a rule, community can be assumed to have the proper amount of alacrity. Any communal issues will be attended to with the proper alacrity, and they will guard it and make sure not to have it become chametz. Chaf Aleph, Kol HaMenachos HaNefos, Nileishes B'Poishrin. Any mincha which is going to be baked. As we saw in the chart, some of them are fried, some of them are in a pan, but some of them are baked. Minchas Ma'afei Taner is literally called oven baked. So some of them were baked. Any mincha which is baked, Nileishes B'Poishrin, have to be kneaded with warm water, or Meshaman and Shaleach Mitzvah, and you must guard them, that they shouldn't become chametz. Why do we trust the process here? Since they're being kneaded and baked in the temple courtyard, anshe pnim is reason hein. Whoever was inside the temple was assumed to have proper alacrity. Uvamokim chav beis says the Rambam, uvamokim shemevashlin kachei kachim sham oifenes hamenachos. Where were the mincha offerings baked? Were the same place where they would cook the highest level of sacrifices, the holy sacrifices, holiest of the holy. Shneimar, as it says, Zeh hamokim asher yivashlu sham akoyanim es ha'asham ve'asachatos asher yoifu es hamincha v'gomer. This is the place where the kohanim will cook the guilt offering, the sin offering, and where they'll bake the mincha. So from there we know minchas are baked in the same places where chatas v'asham are cooked. Chav gimel kol hamenachos tchinasan v'harkadasan b'chutz. All minchas were ground and sifted outside the temple courtyard. V'lishasan v'arichasan v'athiyasan b'fnim. The kneading, the shaping, and the baking, or the mixing, the kneading, and the baking, were done on the inside. V'chol Maaseh treidim bizar ad she'yaveyu lebeis hakmitza. Preparation for the minchas could be done by a non-Kohen until the kmitza point. That kmitza point had to be done by a Kohen. One of the, or two of the types of minchas, individual minchas that were brought in the temple, was called the machavas, the pan, and the deep fryer pan. As we'll see, there were actually different types of pans that were used in preparation of these minchas. Says the Rambam, there was a machavas and a marcheshes. There was a regular pan and there was a deep pan in the temple courtyard. They both belonged to the temple treasury. They were holy vessels, service vessels. They would make anything in them consecrated. As well as the oven used in the temple was a metal oven, special metal oven that they would use to bake whatever minchas had to be baked.